There's one single application you need to get down before August hits, and if you skip it, everything else you've done for your lawn this year, the mowing, the watering, the weed control, none of it is going to matter much once the real heat arrives. It's not fertilizer, and it's definitely not another round of nitrogen. It's the one nutrient almost every home lawn program leaves out entirely. And it's the difference between a lawn that shrugs off a heat wave and one that collapses the first week temperatures climb past 95. My name's Denny. I've spent the last 20 years working on lawns for a living, and I'm going to show you exactly what this is, why the timing matters so much, and how to get it down correctly before the window closes. The nutrient is potassium, and if you've never thought much about it, you're not alone, because most homeowners have spent years focused entirely on nitrogen, the number that makes grass green fast, without ever learning what the other two numbers on a fertilizer bag actually do. Nitrogen drives visible growth and color, which is why it gets all the attention. But potassium plays a completely different role, and it's arguably more important than nitrogen specifically during the stretch of weather you're about to walk into. Potassium regulates something called stomatal function, the tiny pores on a grass blade that control water loss and gas exchange, and it also strengthens cell wall structure throughout the plant. A grass plant with adequate potassium reserves can close those stomatal pores more efficiently during periods of heat and water stress, conserving moisture the plant would otherwise lose rapidly through evaporation, and its cell walls hold up better under the physical stress that intense heat puts on plant tissue. A grass plant running low on potassium going into a heat wave has weaker cell structure and less efficient water regulation at exactly the moment it needs both the most, which is why potassium deficiency doesn't usually show up as a dramatic, obvious symptom the way nitrogen deficiency does. It shows up as a lawn that simply can't handle stress as well as it should, wilting faster, browning sooner, and recovering slower, and homeowners almost always blame that on the heat itself rather than ever suspecting a nutrient gap sitting underneath it. Here's why the timing matters so specifically, and why waiting until you actually see heat damage is already too late to get the full benefit. Potassium doesn't work instantly the way a quick shot of nitrogen does. It needs to be absorbed by the roots and actually incorporated into the plant's cellular structure over a period of roughly 2 to 4 weeks before its full protective effect against heat and drought stress is really established. That means applying it in the middle of a heat wave, after the damage has already started, gives you only partial benefit at best because the plant is trying to build stress resilience while it's already actively under stress, which is a much harder position to recover from. Applying it in the weeks before the heat arrives, while the plant still has the energy and capacity to properly incorporate it into its tissue, sets up that protection in advance, so it's already in place and working by the time temperatures actually spike. For most of the country, late June into mid-July is your window, and if you're watching this anytime before the end of July, you still have time to get this down and see real benefit before the worst of the heat hits in August. Let's talk about what to actually buy, because this is where most homeowners either overpay significantly or grab the wrong product entirely without realizing it. Look for a product labeled sulfate of potash, sometimes listed by its chemical shorthand as 0050, meaning it's 0% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 50% potassium by weight, essentially pure potassium with no other nutrients diluting the bag. A name brand version marketed specifically as a summer stress or heat protection product can run $35 to $45 for a bag covering around 5,000 square feet. The exact same sulfate of potash, sold plain and unbranded at an agricultural supply store or a larger garden center, typically runs $15 to $20 for a comparable amount of coverage, because you're not paying for a summer stress marketing campaign built around an ingredient that costs the same, regardless of what's printed on the bag. Read the label carefully before you buy anything, because a lot of general-purpose summer lawn products blend potassium together with a dose of nitrogen, and applying nitrogen right before a heat wave is actually counterproductive, since nitrogen pushes new tender growth that's more vulnerable to heat stress, not less. You specifically want a straight potassium product with minimal to no nitrogen for this particular application. Application is straightforward. Use a standard broadcast spreader set to the rate listed on the bag, typically somewhere around a ½ pound to 1 pound of actual potassium per 1,000 square feet depending on the specific product's concentration, and walk it in one direction across your lawn, followed by a perpendicular pass to ensure even coverage without missed strips or overlapping stripes. Water it in thoroughly within 24 hours of application, since potassium needs to move down into the root zone to actually be absorbed, and a granular application sitting dry on top of the soil surface isn't doing the plant any good yet. Unlike nitrogen, potassium has a very low risk of burning your lawn even at a reasonably generous application rate, since it isn't the same kind of harsh, fast-acting salt that concentrated nitrogen sources can be, which makes this one of the more forgiving applications you'll put down all season if you're worried about making a mistake. Quick, before I walk you through the results timeline, if you're serious about fixing your lawn without wasting money guessing at products, you need a real plan. That's why I wrote the book, a straight step-by-step blueprint to a greener lawn with fewer weeds, exactly what to buy, where to get it, and when to put it down. Scan the QR code or click the link below to grab your copy. Here's what to actually expect once you've put this down, because unlike a nitrogen application, you're not going to see a dramatic color change in the days right after. And I don't want you thinking it didn't work just because the lawn doesn't suddenly turn a darker shade of green. Days 1 through 7, essentially nothing visible happens above ground. And that's completely expected. The potassium is moving into the root zone and beginning to be absorbed and incorporated into plant tissue, a process that's happening entirely beneath what you can see standing on your porch. Days 10 through 14. If you dig up a small soil sample and look at root structure, you may notice roots appearing slightly more robust and fibrous compared to before application, though this is subtle and honestly hard to judge with the naked eye at this stage. The real test comes with weeks 3 through 6, specifically whatever heat wave rolls through during that window. This is where a lawn that received the potassium application genuinely separates itself from one that didn't, holding color and turgor noticeably longer during periods of high heat and limited rainfall, wilting less dramatically during the hottest part of the afternoon, and recovering faster once temperatures drop back down in the evening. The difference isn't always dramatic to the eye in mild summers, but during a genuinely brutal heat wave, a lawn with proper potassium reserves versus one without can look like two completely different properties by the time August ends. Before you assume every stressed-looking lawn is dealing with a potassium gap, it's worth knowing how to actually recognize the signs, because deficiency symptoms here are subtler than most nutrient problems and easy to write off as ordinary summer stress. Classic potassium deficiency shows up as yellowing or browning, specifically along the leaf margins and tips first, while the center of the blade often stays green longer, giving individual leaves a scorched edge appearance rather than the uniform pale yellow you'd see with a straightforward nitrogen shortage. You'll also often notice weaker stem structure, grass that seems to flop over or mat down more easily than it should under normal foot traffic, since potassium's role in cell wall strength affects structural rigidity throughout the plant, not just its ability to handle heat. And potassium-deficient turf tends to show noticeably worse wilt recovery, meaning the footprint test lingers longer than you'd expect, even on a lawn that's been getting adequate water, because the plant's internal water regulation is compromised regardless of how much moisture is actually available in the soil. If you're seeing that combination, scorched leaf edges, weaker stem structure, and slow wilt recovery despite reasonable watering, that's a much stronger signal pointing toward a potassium gap specifically, rather than simple heat or drought stress that watering alone would resolve. I want to explain why this particular nutrient gets skipped so often. Because it's not that potassium is some secret ingredient nobody's heard of. It's that most consumer fertilizer marketing is built entirely around visible, immediate results. And potassium simply doesn't deliver that kind of dramatic before and after, within a week the way nitrogen does. A bag that makes your lawn visibly greener within 7 days is an easy product to sell and an easy product to photograph for an advertisement. A nutrient that quietly builds heat and drought resilience over 3 to 4 weeks, with a payoff that only really shows up during a stress event that may or may not even happen depending on that particular summer's weather, is a much harder story to put on a bag label. Most general lawn fertilizer blends do include some small amount of potassium, but usually at a fraction of what's actually beneficial for building real heat resilience, because the formula is balanced around making nitrogen the star of the show, with potassium riding along as an afterthought rather than getting the standalone, properly dosed application it actually deserves heading into the hardest stretch of the summer. There's one more piece worth knowing if you want to get the absolute most out of this application, and it's about pairing it correctly with your mowing and watering habits during that same window. Because potassium alone doesn't do all the work by itself. Raise your mower deck to 3.5 to 4 inches for cool season grass, if it isn't already there. since taller grass shades its own root zone and reduces soil surface temperature by a meaningful margin during peak heat, working alongside the potassium's cellular protection rather than against it. And make sure you're watering deeply and infrequently rather than in short daily bursts, since a plant with strong potassium reserves but a shallow, underdeveloped root system from poor watering habits still won't have access to the deep soil moisture that root system needs to actually put that stress tolerance to use. The potassium application builds the plant's internal capacity to handle stress, but it still needs a root system capable of reaching water and a canopy height that keeps the soil beneath it cooler. And all three of those pieces working together is what actually gets a lawn through August intact, rather than any single one of them working in isolation. One distinction worth making before you buy anything, because the exact benefit and urgency here shifts depending on what kind of grass you're actually growing. Cool season grasses, fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, and ryegrass, which dominate the northern two-thirds of the country, are naturally under more physiological stress during peak summer heat to begin with, since their ideal growing temperature range sits well below what August delivers in most regions, which makes potassium's protective role especially valuable for these varieties heading into the hardest stretch of their year. Warm season grasses, Bermuda, Zoysia, and St. Augustine, are naturally more heat tolerant by design and handle high temperatures with less inherent stress, but they still benefit meaningfully from adequate potassium reserves, particularly for improving drought tolerance during dry spells and building better cold hardiness heading into the following winter. Since potassium plays a role in winter stress tolerance as well as summer heat tolerance, if you're managing a warm season lawn, the July application timing still holds for maximizing summer performance. But don't skip a second light potassium application in early fall either, since that's specifically when warm season grasses are building the reserves they'll rely on to survive winter dormancy and green back up strong the following spring. Here's your plan. And the timing on this one genuinely matters more than almost anything else I've covered this season. Get to a garden center or agricultural supply store this week and pick up a straight sulfate of potash product, 0050, with minimal or no nitrogen blended in. Apply it with a broadcast spreader at the rate listed on the bag, walking one direction and then a perpendicular pass for even coverage, and water it in thoroughly within 24 hours. Raise your mower deck if it's still sitting low, and make sure your watering schedule is delivering 1 to 1.5 inches a week in 1 or 2 deep sessions, rather than daily shallow bursts. Do all of this before the end of July if you possibly can, because the 2 to 4 week window potassium needs to actually incorporate into your grass's cellular structure means every week you wait past that point is a week less protection your lawn has heading into the hottest stretch of the year. That's the one thing, and it's the single application I see skipped more than any other heading into the hardest month of the summer. Thanks a lot for watching, and let me know in the comments if you've ever heard of sulfate of potash before this video, because in my experience almost nobody has, despite how much it matters. Now, if you're serious about fixing your lawn without wasting more money guessing at products, you need the right equipment and a plan. My book appearing on your screen right now is a straight step-by-step blueprint to a greener lawn with fewer weeds, exactly what to buy, where to get it, and when to put it down. Scan the QR code or click the link below to get your copy, or head over to fixyourlawnin30days.com to get the lawn you deserve. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next one.